The word she used was leech. It hung in the air over the mashed potatoes I had peeled with my aching hands and the rich brown gravy I had stirred until my shoulder throbbed. My son, Graham, the boy whose fevers I had cooled with damp cloths and whose fears I had soothed with lullabies, didn't flinch. He didn't look up from his plate. He just extended his fork and said, his voice devoid of any emotion, "Could you pass the gravy?" That was the moment the world fractured. It wasn't a loud, shattering break, but a silent, hairline crack that spiderwebbed through the foundations of everything I thought I knew. It wasn't just that I was unwelcome in the house my late husband and I had built. It was that I had become utterly, terrifyingly invisible. And there is nothing in this world more dangerous or more underestimated than an invisible woman with a 30-year-old secret tucked away in a dusty manila envelope. My fork, laden with the overcooked peas that Graham still preferred, paused midair. The metal felt impossibly heavy, a weight I could no longer lift. Across the dinner table in our modest Oregon home, a home that smelled of damp pine and the lingering ghosts of better years, the atmosphere grew thick enough to choke on. My grandson, Walter, named for the grandfather he never met, suddenly fell quiet. His chattering about a model airplane he was building ceased, his bright 6-year-old eyes darting from his mother's taut, angry face to his father's downcast gaze, and finally to me. His expression was a heartbreaking mix of confusion and the nascent fear a child feels when the adults, his pillars of safety, begin to crumble. Children are barometers for the storms we try so desperately to hide. I carefully, deliberately, set my fork down on the stoneware plate, the quiet click a tiny punctuation mark at the end of a very long sentence. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I didn't launch into a futile defense of my existence, a litany of my worth. I didn't remind them that the arthritis swelling my knuckles wasn't an excuse, but a painful reality that made scrubbing pots an exercise in agony. I didn't explain how the deep, persistent ache in my lower back, a souvenir from decades of physical labor, turned the simple act of bending to pick up a stray toy into a monumental effort. And I certainly didn't bring up the past, the years of double shifts, the patched-up school uniforms, the scraped-together savings that had paved the road for the very life they now so carelessly inhabited. Instead, I stood, my joints protesting with a symphony of quiet clicks and groans. I began to clear the table. That was my answer. Not with fire and fury, but with the quiet, devastating dignity of a woman who had been swallowing bitterness for so long she had forgotten the taste of anything else. Later that night, sleep was a distant country I couldn't reach. I lay awake in the guest room, a generous term for the converted den that had once been Walter's study. It still held the faint, sweet scent of his pipe tobacco if I breathed in deeply enough. Now it was just a space, stripped of personality, containing a single narrow bed and a window that overlooked the neighbors' perpetually overflowing recycling bins. The ceiling fan above me clicked rhythmically, a maddening metronome counting out the seconds of my redundant life. From the living room, the heart of the house, I could hear their life continuing without me. The low murmur of the television, a show I couldn't make out, was a constant drone. I heard the soft musical clink of a wineglass, and then Miranda's sharp, tinkling laugh. It wasn't a laugh of genuine joy. It was a sound of conquest, the laugh of someone who had won a battle I didn't even know we were fighting. I didn't weep. The capacity for easy tears had been wrung out of me years ago. But a profound coldness, stark and elemental, settled deep in my bones. It was a resignation born not from a single cruel insult, but from 1,000 tiny acts of erasure over the past 5 years. I was a photograph left out in the sun, my colors fading daily, my edges curling inward. Tonight, the image had finally dissolved into a blank, featureless white. I had ceased to exist. That's what old women do when the night offers no solace. We travel back in time, our minds unspooling memories like thread from a bobbin. I thought of Walter, my Walter, and his slow, painful surrender to the cancer that consumed him from the inside out. I was his anchor in that storm. I was the one who bathed him when his body betrayed him, who pureed his food when he could no longer swallow, who read to him for hours from worn paperbacks, my voice a steady presence in the terrifying darkness. I was the one who held this very house together with careful budgeting, coupons clipped from the Sunday paper, and a stubborn refusal to let the sorrow seep into the floorboards. I thought of Graham as a boy, a whirlwind of energy with scraped knees and a brilliant smile. I remembered working weekends at the old Rosewood diner, the smell of grease and stale coffee clinging to my uniform, just to afford the fees for his baseball league. I remembered sitting up late at night under the dim glow of a single lamp, sewing a patch onto the knee of his only good pair of jeans. I was the loudest voice in the crowd at his high school graduation, a wild cry of pride and relief, even though I was sitting in the back row because we could only afford 2 tickets, and I'd given mine to his then-girlfriend, a girl whose name I could no longer recall. And now, after all that, I was a leech, a mouth to feed, an inconvenience. I didn't leave the next morning. That would have been too dramatic, too satisfying for Miranda. It would have been an admission of defeat. No, my rebellion would be quieter, more insidious. I stayed. I rose at dawn the way I always did, and made the coffee, its rich aroma filling the tense silence of the house. I wiped down the counters. I picked up the lightsaber and action figures little Walter had left scattered on the stairs. I even found a shirt of Graham's with a loose button and sewed it back on with steady, practiced stitches. I moved through the house like a ghost, a silent servant, my presence a constant low-level reproach they could feel, but not name. The breaking point for my departure came 2 days later. They announced they were leaving for a weekend getaway to the Oregon coast. "Just a little trip for the 3 of us," Miranda said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Little Walter needs some beach time, and Graham and I need to reconnect." I was not invited. I was to be the house sitter, the unpaid guardian of their possessions, while they went off to build family memories that deliberately excluded me. Graham wouldn't meet my gaze. He busied himself checking the tire pressure on their SUV, his shoulders hunched in a familiar posture of cowardice. "Have a wonderful time," I said, my voice as smooth and placid as a mountain lake. That afternoon, after the roar of their SUV had faded down the street, I went to my room and pulled a small, sturdy suitcase from the back of the closet. I packed methodically, a few changes of clothes, my toiletries, a well-worn rosary, and at the bottom, a thick manila envelope containing a sheaf of documents and a worn, leather-bound notebook. I left my key on the kitchen counter next to a dish towel I had washed and dried that morning. I didn't leave a note. My absence, I decided, would be my final word. I took a city bus across town, the steady rocking motion a strange comfort. My destination was a small, clean boarding house for women I had found online, run by a stern-faced but not unkind woman named Mrs. Gable. My room was simple, Spartan even, smelling of lemon polish and the persistent dampness of a Portland winter. But it was quiet, it was safe, and it was mine. That night, staring out at the glistening, rain-slicked streets, I finally allowed myself to ask the question that had been haunting me. Was I truly just a burden? Had my life's worth been so completely tied to my utility that once that faded, I was nothing? The thought was a cruel companion in the darkness. But as the first gray light of dawn broke through the clouds, another voice, a voice I hadn't heard in years, answered from the deepest part of me. It was the voice of the young woman who had stood beside Walter and promised for better or for worse. It was the voice of the mother who had fiercely protected her son. It was my own voice, unearthed at last. What if they are the ones who are wrong? The next morning, fortified by a night of quiet resolve, I made a cup of strong black tea. I wrapped myself in the heavy quilt I had made during the long nights of Walter's illness. It stitches a map of my grief and endurance. I picked up my phone. "Mr. Finch," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Sterling Finch. It's Thea Collins." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, then the familiar, low rumble of his voice. "Thea, it's good to hear your voice. It's been too long. Is everything all right?" "I need to ask you something important," I said, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. "Do you still have the paperwork for the house? The deed?" His voice was low and cautious, the voice of a lawyer who has heard everything. "I have everything, Thea." Just as Walter instructed me to, all those years ago. 3 days later, I was sitting in the same worn leather chair in his office that I had sat in after Walter's funeral. The office hadn't changed. It was a comforting capsule of time, filled with the smell of old books, leather, and brewing coffee. Mr. Finch slid a thick folder across the polished mahogany of his desk. "Your husband was a very wise man," he said, his eyes kind. "He was thinking of this day long before you were. He saw the potential for complications." With trembling fingers, I opened the folder, and there it was, printed in stark, irrefutable black ink, validated by the county seal. The quitclaim deed for our property, signed over to me, Thea Marie Collins, solely and completely in June of 1994, just a week after Walter had received his terminal diagnosis. The house was mine. It had always been mine. For 30 years, I had held the power without ever knowing it. "I never told Graham," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. I traced my own name, my legal signature, a ghost from a past self. Mr. Finch gave a sad, knowing smile. "Walter made me promise to keep it quiet unless it became absolutely necessary. His exact words were, 'She built that family from scratch. She should never, ever have to ask for permission to stay in her own home.'" Tears I hadn't shed for Miranda's cruelty now fell for my husband's foresight and love. That wonderful man, even in the face of his own mortality, had been building me a lifeboat. For 5 years, I had felt like a guest, a charity case, in their house. The truth was, they had been living in mine. "I want to sell it, Mr. Finch," I said, and the tremor was gone from my voice, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. "I want to sell it, and I want them to receive the eviction notice from a stranger." He didn't question me. He didn't preach forgiveness. He had been Walter's friend. He understood loyalty. He simply nodded. "I'll handle everything quietly." I walked out of his office with the folder clutched to my chest like a shield. The air smelled of damp earth and diesel fumes from a passing bus. A quiet, seismic revolution had taken place inside me. I was no longer a leech. I was the proprietor, and I finally knew exactly what to do with my house. The boarding house became my sanctuary. In the quiet rhythm of my days, I began to rediscover the woman I was before I became a wife, a mother, a caregiver, and finally, a burden. Mrs. Gable, the owner, was a font of quiet wisdom, and we fell into an easy friendship. I started helping in the communal kitchen, and my cooking, once a source of criticism, was now met with genuine gratitude. It was there I met Agnes. She was a fiery woman in her 80s with a wicked sense of humor and hands as twisted by arthritis as my own. She, too, had been politely exiled from her family home after her husband passed. "They erase you," she told me one afternoon over tea, her voice devoid of self-pity. "The moment you stop being useful in the ways they recognize, you become a ghost they wish would just fade away." Her words resonated deep within me, solidifying my resolve. I would not fade away. I would not die in a small, clean room smelling of lemon polish without ensuring the final chapter of my story was written in my own hand. I met with Mr. Finch again. "The market is strong," he advised. "The house is in a desirable neighborhood. It will sell quickly." He hired a discreet realtor who arranged private showings while Graham and his family were at work or school. The process was swift, clinical, and entirely removed from me. When Mr. Finch handed me the final sales agreement, I took a moment. In my mind's eye, I saw a whirlwind of memories. Walter planting the dogwood tree in the front yard, Graham taking his first steps on the living room rug, the smell of birthday cakes and Christmas dinners. Then, with a steady hand that surprised me, I signed my name. I wasn't just selling a house of wood and nails. I was closing a chapter of my life where I had given everything and been left with an empty account. The seasons turned. Summer faded into the sober gray of a Pacific Northwest autumn. 6 months passed. I had settled into a peaceful routine at the boarding house. I had almost forgotten the exact date the sale was to close. Then Mr. Finch called. "It's done," he said, his voice neutral. "The funds have cleared escrow. The property officially belongs to the new owners. The notification to vacate, along with the legal change of ownership documents, will be delivered by courier tomorrow." I thanked him and hung up. The letter must have arrived on a Tuesday. By Sunday evening, my phone began to ring. It was Graham. I looked at his name on the screen, then set the phone down and let it go to voicemail. He called again and again. On the 5th call, I sent him a single text message. "The house was legally mine. The sale is final and irrevocable." A full day of radio silence followed. Then the inevitable storm broke. It was Miranda, her voice a shrill, cracking shriek of disbelief and fury. "You vindictive old woman, how could you? You sold our home from under us." I held the phone slightly away from my ear, my own voice preternaturally calm. "No, Miranda," I said, the words clear and precise. "It was my home. You were just living there, rent-free. Consider the decades of free lodging my final payment for all the meals I cooked." I hung up before she could unleash another volley. The next call was from Graham. He was weeping, the sound raw and broken. "Mom," he whispered, his voice catching on the word. "We're going to lose everything. Miranda is. She's blaming me. We have nowhere to go. I messed up. Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have said something." I let him speak, his words tumbling out in a torrent of panic and self-pity. When he was finally finished, I didn't yell. I didn't recriminate. I simply said, "I am not taking anything from you, Graham. I am only reclaiming what was already mine." There was a long, shuddering pause. "Can you undo it?" he asked, his voice pathetically small. "I gave 30 years of my life to raising you," I said, the words as clean and hard as diamonds. "I never kept score, but when your wife called me a leech in my own home and you said nothing, the debt came due. I don't want your apology now, Graham. It's too late for that. I just want my dignity back. This is how I'm getting it." I ended the call. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't trying to rescue anyone. I was simply standing up for the woman they had tried to erase. That evening, I sat down with a cup of tea and my old leather-bound notebook, the one from Walter. "For the things we never want to forget," he had written. And I hadn't forgotten. They had just forced me to finally read the ledger. Page after page, it was a quiet testament to a mother's one-sided generosity. 1994, paid off the remainder of Graham's student loan, $2,300. 1999, emergency room bill for a broken arm, $740. 2005, covered 3 months' rent when he was laid off, $3,600. 2011, down payment for their second car, $4,000. 2017, helped with Miranda's extensive dental surgery, $2,100. The total was staggering, well over 6 figures. I had never added it up before. They had made me start counting. With the proceeds from the sale, a sum that felt more like restitution than a windfall. I didn't buy a cruise ticket or a fancy condominium. I bought a rundown 4-unit building on the east side of town. It had a sagging porch and peeling paint, but it had good bones. I hired a local handyman, and together we brought it back to life. We painted the walls a warm, sunny yellow. We planted a garden in the back with herbs and flowers. I named it the Sparrowwood House. Beneath the nameplate, a small engraved sign read, "A place to belong." Agnes was my first resident. Then came 2 more women, both with stories of quiet heartbreak etched in the lines around their eyes. We weren't a care home, we were a cohort. We were a quiet tribe of the forgotten, remembering how to be seen. Nearly a year later, a man stood at our gate. It was Graham. He looked tired, worn down by a world that had not been kind to him. "Miranda left me," he said, his voice flat. "She said I should have handled you. I lost everything." He finally looked at me. "I know I don't deserve it," he said, his voice cracking. "But I'm sorry, Mom, for everything." I didn't invite him in. Instead, I told him about the house. "This place," I said, gesturing to the porch where Agnes was now reading in the sun, "was built with the money from the house you thought was yours. I'm not collecting repayment, Graham. I'm collecting interest on a lifetime of investment." He stared at the peaceful scene, at the lives I was helping to mend. "What can I do?" he whispered. "Live better," I said softly. "Love better. And remember that the people who raised you are not disposable. That's how you can honor what I gave." He nodded, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of the boy I once knew in his eyes. He turned and walked away, not back into my life, but forward into his own, perhaps finally ready to build something worthy of the sacrifices made for him. I sat on my porch at the Sparrowwood House, a chipped teacup warming my hands. The scent of rain and roses hung in the air. Inside I could hear the sound of laughter. This was my justice. It wasn't loud or vengeful. It was quiet. And it was growing. It was proof that I was never just a leech who ate and did nothing. I was a woman who gave, who endured, who remembered, and finally, who rebuilt. The quietest lives, I realized, often leave the deepest echo.